In this video, we'll talk about the different render modes available in Blazor in .NET 8. There are 4 render modes available in Blazor in .NET 8. We have the static render mode, InteractiveServer render mode, InteractiveWebAssembly render mode, and the InteractiveAuto render mode. Of these render modes, InteractiveServer, InteractiveWebAssembly, and InteractiveAuto are called interactive render modes. Let's see how all these render modes work. Now, for this demo, I have the Blazor New Features .NET 8 solution opened up. And before we talk about the various render modes, let's revisit the Blazor web app template and see how the template lets us add support for various render modes. So click File, New, Project and select the Blazor web app template and click Next. Click Next once again. Now, here in the interactivity type drop-down, we have the following options: None, Server, WebAssembly, and Auto, Server and WebAssembly. If we select the None option, then the application will be configured to support the static render mode, but not other interactive render modes such as InteractiveServer, InteractiveWebAssembly, and InteractiveAuto. If, on the other hand, we select the Server option, then the application will support the InteractiveServer render mode. Similarly, if we select the WebAssembly option, the application will support the InteractiveWebAssembly render mode. Now, if we select the last option here, Auto, Server and WebAssembly, then the application will support both the InteractiveServer and InteractiveWebAssembly render modes, but also InteractiveAuto, which provides the ability to switch between InteractiveServer and InteractiveWebAssembly at runtime. Now, if we select the WebAssembly or Auto interactivity types, then an additional client project will be created and added to the solution. In the interactivity location dropdown, we have the following options: per page or component, and global. The interactivity location determines where in our app we want to enable interactivity. So for example, if we select server in the interactivity type and per page or component in the interactivity location, then the entire application will use the static render mode, but then interactivity can be enabled on a per component basis using InteractiveServer render mode. Similarly, if we select the WebAssembly interactivity type and per page or component in the interactivity location, then the entire application will use the static render mode, but then interactivity can be enabled on a per component basis using InteractiveWebAssembly. And finally, what if we select server in the interactivity type and global in the interactivity location? This turns on global interactivity for the app so that the entire application will use the InteractiveServer render mode. So this is similar to a Blazor server app in .NET 7. If we select WebAssembly in the interactivity type and global in the interactivity location, the entire application will be configured to use InteractiveWebAssembly render mode, so the app behaves just like an ASP.NET Core hosted Blazor WebAssembly app in .NET 7. For the current solution, which is Blazor New Features .NET 8, I had selected Auto for the interactivity type and Global for the interactivity location. Let's close this dialog and go to the server project and double-click program.cs class file. Here we can see the call to add interactive server components. This adds the necessary services to support rendering interactive server components. Next, we have the call to add interactive WebAssembly components, which adds services necessary to support rendering interactive WebAssembly components. And if we scroll towards the bottom here, we have the call to add interactive server render mode, which adds configuration for enabling the interactive server render mode. And next, we have the call to add interactive WebAssembly render mode, which configures the interactive WebAssembly render mode. And together, these two calls also enable the InteractiveAuto render mode. Finally, we have the call to add additional assemblies method, where we are passing in the assembly that the counter type is defined. This counter is a Razor component that's present in the client project here. This project got created because we selected the auto interactivity type in the Blazor web app template. Now the add additional assemblies method discovers any routable Razor components that may be present in the client project assembly. Now let's showcase these various render modes. Right-click the components folder and create a new folder called Pages. Right-click the Pages folder and select Add Razor Component and name the component Render Modes. Now at the top of this file, specify an @page razor directive with a route template of /render-modes. Now let's add this page to the navigation menu. So go to the client project and expand the layout folder and double click navmenu.razor. Scroll down and copy the last div with the class nav item and paste it just below. Replace the href attribute value of the navlink component to render dash modes and remove the class attribute for the span tag and replace the weather text with Blazor render modes. Now go back to the server project and right click the components folder and select add razor component and name the component show message and create a button element with the text show message and specify an @onClick razor directive attribute and set it to handle show message click. And specify a class attribute and set it to btn primary. And in the code block below, create a private void method handle show message click. Now when the button is clicked, we want to show a message. So let's create a private nullable string field called message. And inside the event handler, set the message to message1. And over here at the top, inside the heading element, use razor syntax to display the value of the message field. Now go to the render modes component and add the show message component as a child component like so. Now go to app.razor and here we can see we are specifying the render mode razor directive attribute for the routes component and for the head outlet component. So this is setting up global interactivity. Let's get rid of both. So now the routes component will have a default render mode of static. If we go to routes.razor, we can see that it's just a wrapper around the Blazor router component. So now the router component will have the render mode static and the Blazor router will propagate its render mode to any page it routes. So for example, if we navigate to render modes page, then the render modes page will also have the default static render mode. So let's go to rendermodes.razor and it contains show message as a child component. Now the show message component will inherit the render mode of its parent component, which is static. So the show message component will also have the static render mode. Let's go to the show message component. Since this component has a static render mode, it uses static server rendering. So the component is rendered on the server and there is no interactivity either on the server or on the client. So this means that there is no interactive server rendering using Blazor server or interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly. So this means that if we click on the button, nothing will happen. So let's demonstrate that by running the app. Now right click the page and click inspect. Go to the network tab and make sure all is selected and click the Blazor render modes menu item here. And we see that a fetch request is being made for the render modes component as a result of enhanced page navigation. But if we click the WS tab here, we see that there is no WebSocket connection here. This indicates that there is no interactive server rendering using Blazor server. And if we click the WASM tab, we can see there are no assemblies being downloaded either. This means that there is no interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly. And if we click the button on this page, we see that the button is not interactive. This is because the component's render mode is static. That means it uses static server rendering and the component is rendered statically on the server with no interactivity either on the server or on the client. Now let's add some interactivity. We'll first do that by applying a render mode to a component instance. Let's go to the render modes component and for the show message component, let's set an @renderMode razor directive attribute to rendermode.InteractiveServer. Now renderMode is a static class and InteractiveServer and other properties are static properties on this class. So we can take a shortcut here and go to _imports.razor file and use the C# using static feature and specify @using static microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.Web.RenderMode. Now go back to the render modes component and remove the render mode prefix like so. Now with the interactive server render mode, the component is rendered on the server and the component is also interactive. So it uses interactive server rendering using the Blazor server hosting model. Now let's run the app. Right click the page, click inspect and go to the network tab and click WS and click the Blazor render modes menu item. We see that a WebSocket connection has been established. So this indicates that the component is using interactive server rendering using the Blazor server hosting model. And if we click the WASM tab, we can see that there are no assemblies being downloaded. This means that interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly is not used. And if we click the button here, we see that we get the message as the button is interactive. Now for the next two render modes, Interactive WebAssembly and InteractiveAuto, the component needs to be built from the client project. So let's right click the show message component in the server project and select cut and right click the client project and select paste. Now in the render modes component, instead of interactive server, let's say interactive WebAssembly. With the interactive WebAssembly render mode, the component is rendered on the client and the component is interactive. So the component uses interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly. Let's run the app. Make sure to click build solution. So let's run the app once again. And right click the page and click inspect and go to the network tab and click WASM now and click the Blazor render modes menu item. We see here on the right hand side a list of assemblies including the WebAssembly based .NET runtime are downloaded to the browser. This is because the component is using interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly. And if we click the WS tab, we see there is no WebSocket connection being made. This is because the component is not using interactive server rendering using Blazor server. And since the component is interactive, if we click the button here, we see once again we get the message. Finally, we have the interactive auto render mode. With interactive auto, the component is initially rendered on the server via interactive server rendering using Blazor server. And meanwhile, in the background, the Blazor app bundle and the WebAssembly based .NET runtime are downloaded and cached so that it is used on future requests. So this means that although the component is rendered initially on the server via interactive server rendering using Blazor server, on subsequent visits, the component is rendered on the client via interactive client rendering using Blazor WebAssembly. So if we run the app and right click the page and click inspect, this time click the double arrow here and click the application tab and click storage. Now let's clear any site data. Click the double arrow once again and click the network tab and make sure WS is selected here and click the Blazor render modes menu item. We see that we have a WebSocket connection being established. At the same time, if we click the WASM tab, we see a list of assemblies getting downloaded, including the WebAssembly based .NET runtime. So this will be used on subsequent visits to the component. And again, the button is interactive, so if we click the button, we see the message. Now from a static parent component, we can pass parameters to an interactive child component, but these parameters must be JSON serializable. So for example, I can go to the client project and double click show message.razor and I can define a public string property and decorate it with a parameter attribute to make it a component parameter. And over here at the top, I can display the value of the message parameter inside a h4 heading. And back to the render modes component, I can set the message component parameter to message2. And if we run the app and click on the Blazor render modes menu item, we see the message2 getting displayed. But let's say I go to the show message component and define a child content property of type render fragment and designate it as a component parameter, and then render the child content here at the top. And let's go to the render modes component and define some child content within the opening and closing tags of the show message component and run the app and click on the Blazor render modes menu item. We get an exception because we are passing render fragment, which is arbitrary code and it cannot be serialized. This is because from a static parent component, we can only pass parameters to an interactive child component that are JSON serializable. Let's undo the changes that we have made. Now, from a static parent component, we can have sibling child components with different interactive render modes. So for example, one show message component can have the interactive server render mode, while another show message component can have the interactive WebAssembly render mode. Next, we can apply a render mode to a component definition. So we can say at render mode, interactive server, or interactive WebAssembly, or InteractiveAuto. But note that if you're designing a component, you should avoid coupling the component's implementation to a specific render mode. Components should be designed in a render mode agnostic manner. So we should not make assumptions on where the component is running, either on the server or on the client, and it should degrade gracefully when rendered statically. Now there are two scenarios where it is needed to specify a render mode to a component definition. The first is when we want to specify a render mode for all component instances. The second scenario is when the component is not instantiated directly, such as with the routable page component in our case. Now, from an interactive parent component, we can't switch to a different render mode in an interactive child component. So for example, at the page level here, we have interactive server render mode. In the child component, we cannot have interactive WebAssembly. And finally, we can set the render mode for the entire app. This can be done by going to app.razor and specifying an @renderModeRazor directive attribute for the routes component and setting it to the desired interactive render mode, and doing the same thing for the head outlet component as well. So this sets up global interactivity for the app. Now finally, pre-rendering is by default enabled for interactive components. To disable pre-rendering for a component instance, while setting the render mode, we can create a new instance of the desired interactive render mode and pass in pre-render false. Now, in order to disable pre-rendering for the component definition, we can create a private static field of type iComponentRenderMode and initialize it to an instance of the desired interactive render mode, passing in pre-render false. And over here at the top, we can specify the @renderModeRazor directive and specify the field we just created. And finally, we can disable pre-rendering for the entire app by going to app.razor, and while setting the renderModeRazor directive attribute, we can create an instance of the desired interactive render mode and pass in pre-render false. And we should also do the same thing on the head outlet component. So that covers the basics of render modes in Blazor. Next we'll talk about Blazor sections.